It was the most unbelievable, horrible thing that could ever happen to a person. It had happened to my daughter.
10 years later, Brian and Cindy Sanderholm still struggle with their daughter's murder. In 2007, their daughter Jody was abducted, raped, and murdered. Investigators would later arrest Justin Thurber for the unthinkable crime.
He tortured Jody.
Yes.
Yeah, just
For hours.
horrifically.
He was sentenced to death for the crime, including Thurber. 9 men are currently sentenced to death in the state. But Kansas has not executed an inmate in more than 50 years.
Well, the death penalty in Kansas doesn't work.
That's the problem.
Our investigation found an appeals process that's notoriously slow and a state Supreme Court that has consistently ruled in favor of defendants. One example, convicted serial killer John Edward Robinson. He struck a deal with prosecutors in Missouri to avoid the death penalty. But for murders in Kansas, he was willing to risk it. The reason? Since 1976, Missouri has executed 87 inmates. Kansas, none. Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt.
These cases have dragged on for such a very long period of time. Some of the early cases after the legislature reinstituted the death penalty in 1994 are particularly long.
The Kansas Supreme Court has also overturned a number of death sentences, including the Carr brothers, convicted of a crime spree that ended with 4 counts of capital murder and 1 count first-degree murder. In a case that went all the way to the nation's highest court, in an 8-1 ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalties for the Carr brothers with a scathing criticism of the Kansas Supreme Court. Quote, "The Kansas Supreme Court time and again invalidates death sentences because it says the federal Constitution requires it." The opinion continues, saying, "Turning a blind eye would enable state courts to blame the unpopular death sentence reprieve of the most horrible criminals upon the federal Constitution when it is, in fact, their own doing." End quote. Yet in not one of the death sentences in Kansas is the guilt or innocence of the murderer in question. Death sentences are consistently thrown out on technicalities during the appeals process. This frustrates the Sanderholms as they wait for their daughter's killer to be executed.
I'm all for the death penalty. I believe it should be, and I believe it's our responsibility, since it's our law, to execute him and go on or change the law.
In late October, the Sanderholm family traveled to Topeka for Thurber's first appeal in front of the Kansas Supreme Court. Jody's mother, Cindy, knows the odds, but is hopeful she gets justice for her daughter.
He didn't let Jody appeal her life. I mean, he killed her and that was all.